Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard R.J. Escow. Some interesting developments going on in France, as well, of course, as in all of Europe. But here to update us on the labor situation in France, and we'll see where that takes us, is our friend Cole Stangler. Cole is a journalist and author based in Marseille, France, and he's been covering, among other things, the refinery workers' strike, as well. He covers politics and other subjects as well. So first of all, Cole Stangler, welcome back to the Zero Hour.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, as always.
Yeah, well, it's always good to talk to you. And now, as we record this, and as I sometimes remind our listeners, we record on the Thursday, on Thursdays normally, and the show will broadcast radio and podcast on Saturday. It comes up out on television Monday. There's a fast breaking situation going on there. As in so many things, you may be slow in developing, then moments of a rapid change. But basically, why don't we start by, if you could just bring us up to date on the refinery workers' strike we've been seeing there.
Yeah, so what's happened really in the last 3 weeks in France is you've had an outbreak of strikes at the country's oil refineries. You have, depending on how you're calculating it, 7 or 8 big refineries in metropolitan France. And nearly all of these refineries have been affected by strikes, again, starting in late September. But as they've continued up until now, they're starting to have more and more of an impact on fuel supplies in the country. And right now, as we're speaking, about a third of all gas stations in France are reporting shortages of fuel. So that strike is having a significant impact across the country, really, since in the last few days, it's gotten more and more significant. Again, nearly all the refineries have been affected across the country. These refineries operated by, on the one hand, Total, and the other, ExxonMobil. They operate 6 of these refineries, and that's where we've been seeing these protests. I suppose the two most immediately significant developments for viewers and listeners abroad is that you have, on the one hand, the government watching the situation decide to deploy what probably is best translated as back to work orders. So in other words, authorizing local prefectures, that is, police officials, representatives of the state, to issue back to work orders to ensure that these fuel depots, which are often next to refineries, can continue to ship fuel out for essential services. That's been a big escalation on the part of the government, what's called requisitioning workers in France. That was a move that was announced earlier this week as the crisis has gotten more significant. And then the other, critical development here is that we've seen this strike that began in oil refineries start to spread elsewhere. And perhaps that move from the government, to sort of up the ante, may have backfired depending on how this goes, because we're seeing the strike call spread elsewhere. You have workers at the National Rail Company calling for strike action early next week. The big push now seems to be for a national strike on Tuesday, led by one of the 2 major union confederations. So a national day of strikes on Tuesday. They're calling for strikes across the commerce sector. So supermarkets could be affected by this. I saw Amazon workers are also calling for a strike early next week on Tuesday. So you have this starting to impact, broad swaths of the economy. It looks like that's going to be happening early next week. So this movement that started in the refineries clearly resonating with other workers. And again, this move from the government to try to issue back to work orders seems to have backfired. I don't want to speak too soon. We'll have to see how this evolves, but clearly antagonizing other workers who see this as really an attempt to limit their right to strike, which, as you know, is considered to be very important by France and in France, and certainly among labor activists.
Cole, it's fascinating. for a number of different reasons to me, and I think should be to Americans. Number one, of course, this is the refinery workers' strike, the initial set of strikes against the oil companies that have had a very good year, as I understand it, and so including ExxonMobil, one of the companies being struck. Correct me if I'm wrong. So we have, on the one hand, the strike against a sector that is doing itself. Some of the corporations are doing very well, but of course there's the Ukraine situation and the Nord Stream situation and the whole question of access to oil in Europe. I imagine that has somewhat influence the government to take this kind of, national security or whatever. I don't know what the government's, perhaps in a second you can tell me, but I assume there's, this is too much of a threat to national security, stability, or whatever rationale they're using. So the government steps in with orders to stay on the job, enforceable by police, and that you're telling me has caused a number of other strikes to take place. That must be, in part at least, strikes for the right to strike, assertions of the right and assertions of the force, the power of organized labor. This is how I'm reading all of it, but tell me how off base I am.
No, I think that's partly right. I think one way to look at it is, France, like other countries in Europe, really, and in the U.S. as well, of course, is affected by inflation. France, the rate of inflation in France is actually lower than most countries in Europe. A big reason why is because the government has taken relatively bold action when it comes to limiting energy price hikes, precisely because of all the protests that we saw back at the end of 2018 with the Yellow Vest movement. The government is extremely conscious of this issue. So what we've seen is actually inflation in France is just below 6%. Which is much lower than in some of other countries, neighboring countries in Europe, and the Netherlands. It's I believe more than 10%. So those electricity costs are being kept somewhat in check by the French government. But when you have inflation, of course, the other sort of unresolved question is pay, right? So workers' wages have not been keeping up with inflation, and that's really what I think is at the core of the refinery strike. Is that you have these companies that have been making exorbitant amounts of money, especially with the crisis in Ukraine, especially with the COVID crisis. And now you have workers that are saying, well, your profits have nearly doubled. Perhaps you should be sharing that with some of the workers. Just to give you an example here, Total, is a company that their profits over the first half of this year have nearly doubled, up 92% when compared to the same stretch last year. So they're making enormous amounts of money, and they're also distributing that money to shareholders. Last month, they announced a 2.6 billion euro dividend payment to shareholders, and yet not sharing so much with the workers who are asking for a 10% wage hike, which is fairly significant, but they're saying 7% of that is for inflation, and then on top of that, we want to share some of your profits. So from that perspective, it's not that radical of a demand, but I think to get back to the bigger picture here, what's interesting is I think because when the public looks at a company like Total or looks at a company like ExxonMobil, they see the enormous amounts of money that these companies are raking in. I should say as well, Richard, I neglected to mention Total also is one of the few major oil companies continuing to operate in Russia, continuing to profit from this government in Russia that's authoritarian, leading an imperialist war of aggression, and Total is indirectly benefiting from that in Russia. So a lot of things we could go into about Total, but I think when the broader public looks at this, there's not this. They don't view necessarily the refinery workers as privileged, ultra militant union activists. They I think to some extent say, well, you know what? Yeah, it's normal that workers at a company that's doing so well are asking for just a little bit more of sharing in the profits. And I think that's where the government sort of miscalculated here. because that example, and again, we're talking about a very specific sector in a lot of ways. An old industrial sector where workers are making above the national average. It's not a extremely representative sector of the economy, but still, when you look at this kind of conflict play out, it makes you think about the distribution of profits and whether workers are getting their fair share. And I think that's what's resonated with people here. That's why we're seeing this spread to other sectors.
Let's talk about the government's role for a second. We averted, at least for the time being, railroad strike in the United States, and we did so in part because the president stepped in and attempted to broker a deal. I can't say he successfully brokered it because the workers haven't ratified it yet, to my knowledge. But he kind of stepped in and said, "Let's come to a meeting of the minds here," as opposed to immediately going to the step of saying, "Well, we're going to call out the gendarmes if you workers don't stay on the job." Did the Macron government do anything like that? Did it offer any public pressure, for example, toward the oil companies to boost wages more than they had been prepared to do?
Yeah, we're starting to see that finally happen. And again, we'll see what happens in particular at Total in the next few days. But they have been now saying, Total needs to sit down at the negotiating table and make a more significant offer, because Total had been resisting doing that. Their position was, we don't negotiate, with this kind of pressure. I think that the next round of negotiations had been scheduled for November. They didn't want to sit down, but the government has been saying, okay, maybe you should consider reaching some sort of compromise, and we'll see how it plays out. But what I think is interesting as well is if you look at how this is starting to reverberate politically as well. The big difference of this term among many, but one of the big differences, I should say, when you look at this term of Macron's presidency compared to the last one, is he does not have an absolute parliamentary majority right now. He has a relative majority, which means that everything is a little bit more dicey in Parliament. He doesn't really have that ability to just put out proposals and have that rubber stamp, essentially, which is what we had in the last legislature. And we're already seeing this strike reverberate in the National Assembly. What happened earlier this week on Wednesday night is you had the National Assembly, including parts of Macron's coalition, vote in favor of something that the government opposed, which is to have a tax on what are called in France super profits, what have been called super profits, which is a term that comes from the left-wing parties. And the text that was adopted is essentially would impose a flat tax of 35% on stock buybacks or dividends distributed by companies whose profits have risen more than 20% above the average of the last 5 years, I believe, 4 to 5 years. So in any case, that's a measure that super profit tax that Macron's own party was opposing, and they had something of a humiliation Wednesday night in the National Assembly, where you had a key part of his coalition abstain from the vote. So the coalition, the party led by his former prime minister, Edouard Philippe, they abstained, and you had another centrist party actually support this super profits tax. So kind of a humiliation for Macron in Parliament, which shows you again how this issue is resonating. This idea of the distribution of gain profits, and also how fragile this situation in Parliament is. Over the course of the next few weeks, we have some important votes coming up on the budget. There's also this issue of retirement reform that Macron has, for some reason, decided to continue moving on with. And the question is he going to have the votes to be able to do this? And if he doesn't have the votes, could we even move towards a motion of no confidence? So a lot of uncertainty, and this strike is, I think, amplifying some of these some of these questions, some of these tensions.
It's fascinating. And, Cole Stengler, a couple things that come to mind. One is Franklin D. Roosevelt proposed something very similar to this super profits tax during the Second World War. It's not a new idea, but it's an idea with a lot of resonance, I think, particularly as people struggle with inequality. And the second thing is, it sounds like, my personal observation or sense was that Macron's first term was marked by a certain inflexibility and arrogance on his part, or what I perceived. It struck me that way, and I'm sure many others as well, not only in his personal style, but in his sense that this is the way it should be. And you and I talked years ago about this idea of so-called retirement reform, pension reform, and it seems to me now these are ideas that strike at the heart of a kind of French social contract that was fairly stable over a number of decades and a number of different parties in power. And it seems to me now that it sounds like what you're saying is that Macron is in a situation where arrogance is a risky, if not downright impossible course, and yet maybe there's still traces of it in what he's trying to do, and that maybe the unions are, labor and the left, are flexing their muscles in a way that they haven't for some time. Is that true?
Yeah, I think I'll be honest with you as someone who covers politics, and I'm trying to constantly as a journalist think from the perspective of the Macronists and those in government. And I'll be honest with you, I don't really understand why they're so insistent about pushing forward with pension reform at this stage, which is an inflammatory topic. And why would you want to pursue this at a moment in which we have this war in Ukraine, the energy crisis that's affecting Europe? You now have this fragile, a more fragile majority in parliament. Why would you sort of put that on the line by going forward with this reform that is extremely polarizing, that a majority of French people don't even want, depending on how you phrase the question? Because we shouldn't forget either that, back in, things were sort of put on pause with COVID, but up until that point, we had some mass protests in France with the yellow vests, the first wave of pension reform protests, and I really, for the life of me, don't understand why they're deciding to go forward with pension reform at this particular moment. Could you call that arrogance? That's one sort of hypothesis. If you just are so confident that you think it's going to pass, is it maybe a calculation that, well, sort of like a, Naomi Klein shock doctrine kind of thinking? Well, we're in this sort of moment, it's up in the air. This is, it's sort of now or never. We need to get it done now. But it strikes me as incredibly risky from their point of view. Because,
I'm sorry to interrupt, Cole, but it's very reminiscent to me of what Obama tried to do in 2010 in the midst of the financial crisis, attempting to push through Social Security, quote unquote, reform that would have involved a reduction in benefits. The parallel is fascinating, and in that case too, I found it somewhat baffling, except that in that case, I could put it down to a kind of conventional economic wisdom that had captured the then leadership of both parties and much of the city of Washington, D.C. But in the case of Macron, I don't know if it's that. Arrogance is perhaps a superficial motive for me to ascribe it to, but maybe it's an article of faith. Maybe they really believe that this needs to be done. But it seems to me that maybe I'm reading too much into it, that they're heading into ever increasing states of precarity by pushing this at the same time that there's this labor pushback.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I agree with you, but I think part of it is ideological. Macron is someone who's sort of famously hard to kind of define ideologically, but just in the sense that he's not, I don't think, he's not quite on the same level as, let's say, the new British prime minister.
Right.
He's not quite someone who has a little bit more political savvy than that. But for the French right and sort of the French kind of pro-business vision of politics, retirement reform has been the issue for a long time. Since the mid 90s. This has been on the agenda, and we've seen various attempts to reform it. And so I think part of it simply is ideological. It's that this is something that needs to get done. France it's too complicated to have all these 42 different pension systems. We need to have a more less generous and more coherent, unified system. And it's something like an article of faith, I think. But it's incredibly dangerous moment that the left, from their perspective, the left is stronger than it has been in some time. They were just coming out of a sort of difficult news cycle with you had accusations of sexual harassment and affecting important figures in the left, which took up a lot of time and discussion. And a lot of dysfunction also among those parties, but this sort of shift back into bread and butter economic issues and neoliberal reforms is a great way to sort of rejuvenate the left. And there's a big march actually, which we haven't even mentioned, on Sunday that the parties of the left have been calling for against the rising cost of living as well. So that adds into this cycle about economic inequality and the need to better distribute gains and profits. So the left, potentially could benefit. And then, of course, you also have the far right, which is always sort of looming in the distance, which isn't as significant as a force of the left as the left is in parliament, but which still is, has its biggest share in parliament that we've seen in the Fifth Republic, which would also stand to benefit. So a lot of turbulence, and maybe next time you can talk to a Macronist who can give you their version of why they want to pursue pension reform, because again, it strikes me as something that's extraordinarily risky.
Well, being a being a technocrat, a self-styled technocrat with no ideology is an ideology. This is what it was like talking to Obama people about their version of pension reform was, well, it just needs to be, we're neither left nor right, we just want to do what's right. Well, no, there's an ideology behind all of that, whether the individual is aware of it or not. But not to get too far afield from the subject at hand, let's talk about the left for a second. So La France Insoumise, I believe that's the name of the party, which is, I guess, translated as something like French uprising or something like that, France uprising or France standing up or something like that.
I've seen unsubmissive France, which seems to me just kind of strange. I prefer saying that France Insoumise just in English, but yeah, that's unsubmissive is weird and strangely personal sounding, but okay, La France Insoumise, that's led by Mélenchon, right? And so is he? They're the largest left bloc. Right. So he considered and I know there was a scandal involving one of his lieutenants or something and sexual harassment accusations, but at this point, is Mélenchon the de facto leader or figurehead of the left, or is it more diffused than that? It's a very good question. We don't really have a clear answer. Mélenchon did not run for parliament this time. He was, in theory, supposed to be taking a step aside, but he's sort of always kind of looming in the background of everything, always weighing into issues, even when it doesn't necessarily help the different forces in the left, even when it's defending, a colleague who's accused of violence against his wife. Mélenchon's always kind of looming in the background, but he's sort of the de facto leader of the France Insoumise. And one of the big issues with the party is that it's unclear who's going to sort of take over the reins. He's such an emblematic figure we don't know who's going to really fill his footsteps. Fill his fill that role. The person who I'm talking about, Adrien Quatennens, who is just who was admitted actually to violence against his wife. I think they're going through a divorce right now. He was presumed to potentially be the next sort of Mélenchon, and that's obviously not happening right now. So there's sort of a leadership vacuum as well on the left, and it's also important because one thing I didn't mention is if you have this vote of no confidence, you have the possibility of having new elections. Macron has said that he sort of used the threat, saying fine, you don't want to vote for the budget, you don't want to vote for what I want, then we'll call for new elections. And the left is going to have to figure out a way to get its act together. If that happens, again, maybe that's just a negotiating tool from Macron, but the left had this sort of moment in the legislative elections of coming together for the first time with, it's called the NUPES, the New Popular Union coalition, bringing together these four parties, La France Insoumise, the Socialist Party, the Greens, and the Communists. So they are united, but it's, like I said, a difficult news cycle, and maybe that's not even being fair. It's some really bad errors, also violence against women, sexual harassment, and accusations being flung around, and it's a really difficult situation for them right now. But maybe what's happening is an opportunity to sort of regain the momentum. But yeah, to get back to your original question, Richard, is that there's a clear leadership vacuum for Mélenchon, and it's this difficult question of to what extent was the success of La France Insoumise dependent, for better or worse, on this sort of larger than life political figure, which is always the question that we ask when it comes to Bernie Sanders as well.
Right, of
it's
course.
Both a strength and a weakness. How much of it is just the person himself? So.
And it also makes you wonder if France is going into, makes me wonder, if France is going into a period of renegotiation, realignment of forces, and that, election or no election, you basically have three factions. You have the centrism, so-called, led by Macron. You have the far right, led and represented by Marine Le Pen, but you have the left. If these three forces have to somehow jockey, negotiate, position them to, election or no, I would think that the absence of a leader, a clear leader on the left, puts it at a disadvantage relative to the right and the center. Is that even in addressing this labor situation now, is that fair, you think?
Yeah, I think I think Mélenchon at this point, I'll go even beyond what you're saying. I think at this point it's fair to start asking, is it starting to be a liability, the fact that he's just so present at this point? He said he wasn't going to run again for president. He's now run 3 times. He said he was stepping away from political life, but here he is, all the time on in TV studios and the radio, tweeting things. You're getting in trouble for poorly phrased tweets, creating these problems that didn't necessarily need to exist. And at some point it's becoming a liability. And you're going to need to fix that. I don't really know what the solution is.
No, I don't either, but I think
people have been asking for years now. And now we're finally at this moment. You can look at polls and sort of like other figures. There's François Ruffin, who was a sort of documentary filmmaker, kind of similar to Michael Moore, who was elected to the National Assembly in 2017 from the north of France in Picardy. He's been floated as maybe someone who could step up, but unclear if he really has the sort of profile to do it. You have a couple of other figures that have I feel fine saying this, massive egos that crave media attention. The head of the last candidate from the Communist Party, Fabien Roussel, who sort of addicted to media attention and getting into debates about really inconsequential things. Like, I don't know if this has gotten attention in the U.S. Probably not, but he likes talking about how much he likes meat and the importance of having French people be able to get meat and eat meat. And then the debate between him and then the Green Sandrine Rousseau, who's an eco-feminist, takes the opposing standpoint on meat. So you have people that love, debate in the spotlight, but I don't know how productive that is for the left. You have figures like Mathilde Panot in La France Insoumise, who's sort of younger, who's been taking more of an important role. Maybe she could fill the shoes, but clearly it's an open question.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, in flux for sure. So last question, Cole Stengler, I guess. Is this, France has always had a much stronger labor organization culture, not always perhaps, but certainly in recent decades, and probably always, of labor organizing, of union power, of that type of thing. Is this latest, what's developing into a wave of strikes at this moment, is this a sign of a resurgence of any kind, or is this a power that's always been there and it's just the latest manifestation of it? Is this a shift of some kind, or is this just the way things happen in France?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. There's the way these movements sort of seem to happen in France is just it's the way the political culture and the sort of labor movement culture, the way it exists is you have these kind of triggers that just spread movements, and they seemingly sort of can kind of come out of nowhere and spread like wildfire. And that's to some extent what we're seeing, what looks to be happening again. But the question, sort of as always, as it's been in recent years, let's say the last couple of decades, is to what extent is this going to involve workers who are outside the orbit of the more militant unions who aren't already going to go on strike? That's always the question. Is this going to reach sectors of the workforce that don't necessarily have a lot of union density or union support, or is it going to be sort of constrained to the sectors where the CGT, that's basically what we're talking about, the CGT and to a lesser extent other unions, but most of the CGT sectors where they're strong, we're talking about, rail workers, which are, they have obviously legitimate grievances and needs, but still a fairly specific sector of the economy,
Right.
Rail workers, people in the metro system, refinery workers, I think we should be, wondering, is this going to reach, what is the strike going to look like at Monoprix, the supermarket, or Carrefour? Right. Is it going to pick up at Amazon? This brutal, vicious private sector company that the unions don't have that much of a foot in. That's the question, as always, and the union movement in France and the CGT is sort of held on to this. This important, swath of the economy, but they've defended their gains. But again, the question is, how do you expand beyond this sort of orbit, which is the classic dilemma or the classic challenge that unions and more militant unions have faced in France for quite some time.
Well, it will be fascinating to see to what extent, first of all, does this general strike develop, to see to what extent this does or does not turn into a shift of worker culture in France and towards broader unionization. And Cole Stengler, thanks for reporting on it. I hope you'll come back soon and let us know Absolutely. What's happening. Okay, so again, my guest has been Cole Stengler, based in Marseille, France, journalist and author. As always, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You bet. We'll be right back after this. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.